Much, Alexandra. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yep. Okay, great. Well, I want to extend my thanks on behalf of myself and my team here at the National Drought Mitigation Center and our colleague and friend from FNSEMI and Sierra, Eduardo Martins. Thank you very much for the invitation to be with you here today to share our experiences on drought and as we hope to hear. Hello? Yeah, and as well, we hope through this process to continue to have a two-way street when it comes to dialogue and what we learn from you in the process. I've been working with the Drought Mitigation Center since it formed in 1995, and my first international trip 2 years later in the late 90s was in fact to the Nordeste region for 2 weeks between Fortaleza and Recife. And that started a very long journey on drought with our friends and colleagues in Brazil. In those early days, primarily in the Northeast, but very encouraging to see the receptiveness of Southern Brazil and Western Brazil in particular over the last decade or so in regards of drought risk management, which is what I'm going to speak with you all here today about. So the Drought Mitigation Center, as I mentioned, has been around since 1995. I would consider us to be a boundary organization, which means our job is to translate science to policymakers, to decision makers, to the media, and to the public. And we do this around basically the premises. Our work is centered around the 3 green bubbles on the left, which we'll later refer to as the 3 pillars. And we'll talk a lot about that between myself, Kelly, and Deb. I'm a climatologist by training, so I come at it from the physical science part, but we have about a 50-50 mix in the center, maybe a little less than that now with some new hires that have the social science as well, which is very important for what we do with outreach, extension, and education, and then stakeholder engagement. So these 3 green bubbles, monitoring and early warning, policy and planning or mitigation, and vulnerability and risk assessment. The idea is that we get our message out to these stakeholder groups in the blue bubbles. And the goal is to create not just useful information, but actual information that is usable to inform policy making, decision making, and or resource management. And our experiences come in the last 27 years or so, working globally. We do a lot of work around the world, over 90 countries to date between our staff over these last 2.5 decades. You can see the countries here in dark blue are the countries we've worked with over the last year or so. And the light blue shows countries that have been involved in the last decade or more. So we have a tagline here that kind of captures what I think we do, and that's we're focused entirely on drought. That's our entire concentration and focus is on that. A lot of other groups have to wear many hats, multi-hazard centers, or maybe they're just involved in flood or water management. And drought really cross-cuts across many of these things. So it's all built on building partnerships and collaborations. And I've just listed a few here at various scales. You know, in this particular activity with the Department of Interior and the Consulate at Brazil and the embassy, this sort of technical assistance or capacity building, if you will, is done at many scales, from the local scale here with our federal agencies up to international donors, as you can see in these icons here. So let's get to the topic here today, which our focus is on drought, which I realize I'm probably preaching to the choir here with you, is obviously very important, particularly with the changing climate and a warming planet. The drought becomes a very intense, what we call stressor. And if you think about it compared to floods, tornadoes, typhoons, or hurricanes, they have a relatively smaller footprint. and they typically come and they're gone relatively quickly compared to drought. Droughts can come and cover millions of square hectares, and they can last months, years, or even decades. So it just depends on where you are. Context is very important, but in general, drought is one of the, if not the leading cause of death and or economic impact. It cuts across many sectors, as we'll hear about here later on today with my colleagues. And so it becomes a big issue when we're talking about, I know this has been an issue in Brazil going way back, and other areas where you have migration out of rural areas to urban areas, and the pressure that puts on services for food and water security, because it's all about water. So not just water quantity, but also water quality when it comes to sanitation and health, and also when it comes to conflict on international borders. All of this drought really comes to the front when it comes to what's going to stress these environmental factors, more so than any other hazard. But the problem is, if you're familiar with the hydrologic cycle, here's what Dr. Wilhite had coined, who was the founding director of the Drought Center and done many, many trips and work in Brazil, the hydroillogical cycle. So typically when things are good and the rains fall, there is a tendency to be apathetic. Let me go back to that. We tend to be more apathetic, right? Until we start to see impacts. And then all of a sudden we become aware. And by the time we're really ready to do anything about it, panic sets in and it becomes a pure ad hoc response moment. And that's the wrong way to deal with it. But this is human nature, not just with drought, but with most hazards, is we're dealing with the disaster du jour, so to speak, sort of what's the thing we have to deal with right now, and not thinking about what we need to deal with in the next 5, 10, 20 years. So this is typically what you would see with a crisis management approach, very responsive, not proactive, but rather reactive. And what we want to advocate is up here on top. What can we do across the 3 pillars to reduce our impact due to droughts? We're not going to stop droughts from happening, but how can we reduce the effect of droughts on our economy, on our people, and the issues that they cause societally and economically? Because drought is a big economic, can have a really large economic effect. So on the left here, here's typically what you would see in a reactive crisis management approach. It's the most expensive way to deal with any hazard. So it's coming sort of after you're in it. When you have response to, say, not the best management practices, it's only going to enable that to continue. So it's going to continue to reward poor resource management. And it's really treating the symptoms, not the cause. So in essence, it really continues to increase our vulnerability instead of reducing it by leaning on government programs to come in and continually spend a lot of money to, quote unquote, fix the problem, but it's not really fixing the problem. It's just kicking the can down the road. So what can we do to better change that narrative? Well, that would be through risk management. How can we invest both short-term and long-term in activities, mitigation activities? And I should define mitigation in the context of drought to mean, what can we do in advance of drought, or maybe at the very beginnings or onset of drought, to reduce the impacts? It's not the climate change mitigation definition of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, although that would help too, because if we have lower temperatures, droughts behave a little differently than they do under these extreme stressing events when you have increased temperatures or heat waves associated with them, or as we know more today, these flash droughts that come on very quickly. The stigma was always drought's a very slow onset, invisible disaster. And that's still true, but we have to recognize that more recently we're seeing very rapid onset, intensifying droughts that come on in the matter of just a few weeks or a few months. not years, not in every case. And again, increased temperature is moving water through that water cycle, the hydrologic cycle, very quickly in that situation. So again, we want to get to addressing the root causes, and that comes into what you'll hear from Kelly Smith later today in her presentation. And instead build self-reliance, which is ultimately the more adaptation taking place can build resilience, is going to buffer them better. It doesn't mean they're not going to have impacts. It doesn't mean there's not going to be issues, but the idea is to make those impacts less. So we want to tip the scales from here on the left, where we're dealing with things after the fact. And instead, we want to tip the scales to the right, where we're taking action. That it doesn't mean there's not response either, because that's still important. And people still need to be helped out, especially in very extreme droughts. But the idea is, again, to move us more towards a proactive before drought set of activities to adapt to future droughts and make us more resilient to those future droughts. Instead of just, again, acting, reacting, you're just going to keep doing the same thing over and over, and you're going to be tied into that hydrological cycle forever. So that's what we're trying to break and get a balance now between those two. We still need response, but we need to start thinking, how do we shift that? How do we get political will? How do we get the financial incentive to reward folks for coming over to the more proactive side, investing in it like you would invest in a better road or a better water main? Think of it almost in an infrastructure way. Drought's a little different because it's not always about infrastructure, of course. Although there's a lot of waterworks that are very critical to move water around a country. And I know Brazil has worked on this issue in the past as well. So let's spend the last couple of minutes for my talk, and I'll try to get us back on time a little bit, on the three pillars. I think it's very important to know that these are broad enough that they can be just serve as a blueprint. It's not a prescribed process. It can be very organic and very much tied to the local situation in the state of Rio Grande do Sul. That might be a little different than how they deal with it up in Ceará, for example, or any of the other states in Brazil. But there's some common ways we can tackle this. And a lot of this was born out of Dr. Wilhite's 10-step process. So a couple definitions. What do I mean by drought management and drought policy? Well, here are the three pillars up here I talked about: monitoring and early warning, vulnerability and impact assessment, and then mitigation, preparedness, and response, or planning. So drought policy are any one of a number of actions that a country or a state or even a city, even a utility, I mean, it can be at a number of scales, what they can do to prepare for and respond to drought and reduce impacts of future droughts. So any sort of legislation, drought plans, you're going to hear some example, I think, that ties it very nicely together from Eduardo Martin from FNSEMI and Ceará, and some of the ways they have actually built some triggers tied off of these three pillars. So I think it's a very good case study. And then drought management are those actions taken during a drought or proactively before a drought, which again can reduce the effects of drought. And again, it's both. It's not just response or just mitigation. You need both. So I'm going to focus mostly on pillar 3, and then Kelly and Deb are going to focus on pillar 1 and 2. And Eduardo will come in and have a really great case study that really, I think, integrates all three. So we're going to focus on pillar 3 for the last part of my talk. So I think it's important to state up top that, in my opinion, maybe the older paradigm, say 40 years ago or so, or 30 years ago, was that you have to have only a standalone drought plan. Well, we know today, many of you on this call today, and thanks again for spending your Friday afternoon with us to talk about this, wear many hats and have to deal with many hazards. And so maybe the best way, while we still totally advocate a standalone plan, which can be dedicated just to drought, that's great. But if you can't do that, can you find a way to integrate drought mitigation, drought risk management into another planning process? Maybe it's a water plan or a climate change adaptation plan or a multi-hazard plan. And you can see some examples here. Again, it's to better coordinate response, to coordinate mitigation actions between secretariats, ministries, states, countries, water basins, you name it. That this approach is very flexible. And again, it's not prescriptive. So it has to be what works for you. And that's what the stakeholder engagement, and that's ultimately the goal of a drought risk management planning process. And there's many, many resources out there now, which I'll touch on here a little bit. So one of the outcomes of a high-level drought meeting held in the United Nations at the World Meteorological Organization in Geneva about a decade ago now was what it resulted in was the development of what's called the Integrated Drought Management Program, IDMP. And they've put out a lot of great resources, and my team and others have worked closely with them over the last decade. And in fact, next year, there will be a high-level drought meeting number 2, what we're calling plus 10, that will be held somewhere to sort of bring back people together and see what sort of success has this led to, and what have we learned, and what can we do better. But basically these bullets here, and I will not read them all to you, is to try to capture what progress they have been making in helping countries prepare for drought through better integrated drought risk management policies and plans. And the 3 pillars are really, I think, what came out of that played off of the Drought Mitigation Center's 10-step process that Dr. Wahai did. So that's what I'm going to touch on here. And all these slides will be made available to you later so that you don't have to capture all of these bullets. But I just wanted to let you know we're more than happy to share this information with you freely. Response is what we talk about when it comes to drought implemented during or following a disaster. Too many times it's usually just after. And again, that's usually the most expensive way to deal with responding to drought. Still very important piece, but what we'd like to see a shift of investment of resources is into mitigation. And these are those actions we take in advance of drought. So you've heard me say this many times already, but it's always easier said than done. And yet, again, with the hydrological cycle, human nature is such that we just tend to kick the can down the road, and we'll deal with it next time. And instead, what we really want to see that is built into better planning now, so that when that drought comes, it's a coordinated effort in responding to that drought. It's a coordinated effort in advance of that drought through mitigation activities and policy and planning, so that we reduce that impact or reduce that vulnerability down the road. And preparedness, again, adaptation, being ready for responding to that next event. Okay, so I've touched on all this already, so in the interest of time, let me skip to this. Now, this is sort of a visual of what I said earlier, that we advocate drought planning can be at any of a number of scales or in any of a number of processes. Water plans, multi-hazard plans, climate change adaptation plans, or standalone drought plans. And this can be done at all scales, from the national level down to a watershed. In the US, we have states and tribes for indigenous folks and their drought planning process. And then we have community and even individual ranchers that we provide resources on how to help them build and develop drought mitigation plans. But at the end of the day, we like to say all droughts are local. So no matter what scale you're working with, the stakeholders, start at the very bottom, and that's where the most hurt is felt when it comes to the impacts of drought. Typically, I mean, it might be a very small part of the gross domestic product, but for those local regional levels that are impacted by drought, it's catastrophic, and it can be a much more bigger effect than just tying something to a gross GDP, for example. All right, so you'll also hear a little bit about this or see examples when Deb talks between the reason we want to use all 3 pillars. It's very difficult. If I could use the analogy of a stool, the 3 pillars could be a 3-legged stool. If we have a one-legged stool, it's kind of more difficult to balance and sit on that one-legged stool. If we have a three-legged stool that has all three pillars, it's going to be better and easier to sit on that stool. So we want to be able to tie triggers to plans, and that's going to coordinate who does what and when do they do it. And that sort of a drought plan is going to be more efficient in responding to drought. And ultimately there will be a cost savings involved. There have been some recent studies by the World Bank that looked at that cost benefit ratio of each dollar invested equals how many dollars can you expect to save down the road. And you'll see estimates anywhere from $3 to $5 to up to $10 or more of mitigation dollars invested is going to be worth $30 to $50 or more of reducing costs down the road. So it just depends on which sector and which study you look at. But in general, they all agree there is benefit to investing in mitigation up front. So that's what we want to do, is have a plan that has triggers, that's tied to understanding the risk and vulnerability across the country of Brazil, and also just between and within regions and within individual states. The vulnerability may not be the same in one part of the state versus another part, depending on any number of factors. And Kelly will touch on that in a little bit. So these triggers are what actually, as I mentioned, are tied into the plan. And so you really need both of these hand in glove. It doesn't do any good to have a great plan and no triggers, because there is nothing to trigger action in the plan. And conversely, if you have a great monitoring and trigger system, but it doesn't enact any policies or any activities in the plan, they both really don't function as well as they would if they're both together. So we need them to work together. And it's also important to keep in mind, it's not, many groups have these triggers going into drought and they don't really think about it coming out of drought. It doesn't behave the same way coming out of drought. So you don't want to call drought too early. There has to be some degree of risk assumed, depending on the sector involved. What are they willing to risk? Let's say from an insurance standpoint. But then on the other hand, we don't want to call it off too soon either when you're coming out of drought. So there's a fine balancing act. And again, that differs from state to state and region to region. All right. So again, on planning, when we're focusing on preparedness, again, understanding those needs at the various levels, whether it's statewide, regionally within the state, or down to a community level, or a watershed. It's important to involve all those voices at the table in the planning process to understand where those needs are, where those vulnerabilities are. And having that be a transparent process up front will hopefully reduce conflict down the road, because they will have had a voice at the table instead of just prescribing something top down. So the ones we've seen work best, and we've worked in all around the world with different countries, typically have a nice blend of bottom up and top down, and in involving stakeholder voices at that table when you want to know where you're impacted by drought. This is also the user of the drought early warning information system material. And again, I think you're going to hear very nicely at the end of the day from Eduardo that kind of ties up what we're talking about here conceptually, is really going to bring it home, I think, to a case study in Brazil. But we want that transparency, and we want that buy-in from being open and having the public aware of what we're doing. So there's a broad range of what we call, quote unquote, these mitigation actions. Again, what can we do in advance of drought to reduce impacts later on, during, and after drought? And we want to, again, remember that scale graphic I showed at the very beginning. We want to keep the balance tipped, and if anything, tipped away from just only responding to drought. We want to look at mitigation of drought too. We can do lots of exercises to get that from stakeholders. We can do through the planning process, scenarios or tabletop exercises. We have lots of good guidance now and materials on our website that address these, that I just don't have time in a short talk today, but know that they're there and they're free for you all to use. So you're kind of maybe asking, well, what do you mean by drought mitigation actions? What sort of, how can we put these into different categories? And here's just a few, right? Again, centered around the 3 pillars. Having a good early warning system, of course, is one of those, but there's all these other things: improved communication and coordination, education, having a plan in the first place. There's a lot of places that just don't even think to have a drought plan. They might have a water plan, but oftentimes water plans are focused more on flood control and delivery of water supply, but not necessarily what do you do when you don't have enough, but when you have too much. So we want to change that mindset. Emergency managers also have a different mindset when it comes to drought. So how do we get this all enacted eventually into a plan and into legislation or policy at the governmental scale? What's the governance of this process? So there's a lot of obvious ones that I'm sure many of you on the call today are very familiar with, that look at how do we augment water supply? How do we build in an alternate water supply? How do we move water, in other words, through a system? Anything like that can help us deal with a time of drought where we can move water where they need it. But then you have also a lot of politics involved with that too, right? Let's not fool ourselves. Politics, drought is very political. And so it's easier said than done for some of this. But having a good drought plan that spells it all out, that has the buy-in of all these groups that participated in the plan, is the best way to ensure that when the drought does come, there will be a unified response to that drought. And that's ultimately what we want to do through mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. Okay, so let's talk about some current future drought management concerns. Most of the time, these have been very reactive, which I've already illustrated is costly and inefficient, poorly coordinated. And instead, with a warming climate and climate change, if anything, our impacts are increasing. And it's that relationship between different sectors, the environment, agriculture, water supply, it becomes very complex very quickly, and demonstrates where conflict is going to rise up in those areas that are most vulnerable. And what we want to do is reduce that impact of future droughts. But we have to collect those impacts, and that's a big gap, right? And I think Kelly will hopefully touch on that a little bit, that we haven't done a great job of systematically capturing that. We're trying to do a better job now. And I think, again, Kelly will speak to that. How do we tie together the 3 pillars? And really, between what you hear from me and then what you hear from Kelly and Deb and Eduardo, I think you'll start to see how these come together. At least I hope so. And then, again, we talked about we have to face the reality of what increasing temperature is doing to droughts and the characteristics of drought. Now, this isn't something that's going to come in 20 or 50 years. We're already seeing this with increased dry days, days between wet events. And when rains come, how they're much more intense, and then that runs off more quickly. So how efficient or effective is that rainfall? So that all goes into how long it takes to recover from a drought based on the resilience of a particular region, the adaptation in that region. And how can we convince policymakers that investment in mitigation, investment in drought activity upfront is worthy of that investment and will save money down the road? These are really, really key things, I think, to think about as you think about drought in the future. So I've touched on almost everything on this slide, except I just want to mention one bullet here, and that's the third one, and that is to start simple. That can really evolve over time, but we've found, our drought monitor in the United States, which now is dozens of inputs, started with only 5. We started very, very simple. And I think Eduardo will tell you they started pretty simple in the Northeast region, And now they've seen that expand and as they've gotten buy-in from people on the ground in those states, and then that is pushed south in Brazil as well. So I look forward to hearing from him as an update of the activities in Brazil. And with that, I'm gonna show you my contact information here, but also, try to get us back on time a little bit here. I think we've caught up a little bit, but I'm assuming Alexandra, that maybe we have time for a quick question or two if needed. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that excellent presentation and for catching us up on time. I hope that the presentation really resonated with our group here, especially this idea of integrating drought risk management planning across groups. And I know from looking at the audience and from preparation that our audience has planners and technical experts from a number of different departments and secretariats, which really speaks to the thinking of how to collaborate in Rio Grande do Sul. I also have heard that drought planning is somewhat new to the state, so the idea of keeping it simple, I think, is an important one. So thank you so much for that. We do have about 5 minutes for questions, which maybe is 1 to 2 questions. If there is anyone who has a question, I don't see any yet in the chat, and I haven't received any. So I'll give 1 moment here. If anyone has any questions at this point, please raise your hand and I'll be happy to unmute you and we'll take your question, or you could
I,
put it in the chat.
I hope it's not Caipirinha time yet. So
I, I know we have to keep everybody
you know,
focused before it's that time, Friday afternoon. But I really do appreciate this great audience, and I know from the
yes.
names that we have a wonderful, diverse audience here. So, Diego, do you have a specific question? No, just coming on camera. No pressure. All right. Oh, go ahead.
Não, não chegou a ser uma pergunta, mas é na linha que
Along the lines of what Alexandra mentioned, it seems like the pillars are well put, and the drought is not something new for the state of Rio Grande do Sul. However, to face the droughts with the monitoring system, this is all new. So what's been said today has a lot of applications in the work we are developing within the water resource department. That's basically it. It's not a question, it's a comment, but I think the presentation was very productive.
Thank you,
you.
Diego. Thank you.
Thanks, Diego. And yes, of course, unfortunately, drought is not new, but a different way perhaps of thinking about drought management is what we hope we can get out of these 3 sessions. And of course, this is a complete collaboration. We have a lot to learn from our Brazilian colleagues as well as our US colleagues on the line. So without further ado, let's take a break, and at 3 p.m., so in 6 minutes from now, we'll restart the presentation with Kelly's presentation. So please, everyone, feel free to enjoy the next 6 minutes, take a break, and we'll meet back here at 3 p.m. sharp to begin the next presentation. Thank you all very much. Hi, Kelly, you ready?
I am.
Excellent. I'll give 30 more seconds and get going. And you do have time, and I know the interpreters appreciate a slow pace in speaking.
Okay. Yes.
I think we'll aim to conclude at 3:45. I think we can stick to the program on the slide.
Okay. Do you want me to go ahead and share my screen now?
Sure, I think we can go ahead and do that. Welcome back, everybody. We're ready for the second presentation of our program, which is a presentation on the evaluation of risk vulnerability by Dr. Kelly Smith, who is also from the National Drought Mitigation Center. So we'll continue in the same format with hopefully a little bit of time for questions at the end. And again, if any issue comes up, please feel free to share a message in the chat. Please, Dr. Kelly Smith, go right ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Alexandra. I am a research assistant professor here at the National Drought Mitigation Center at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I was one of the original employees in 1995. At the time, I had a background in journalism and public relations, and I now serve as the center's communications coordinator, among other things. Since joining the center, and I say this so you'll know that I'm kind of on the social sciences side, leaning all the way over into humanities. I've also acquired a master's degree in community and regional planning and a PhD in the human dimensions of natural resources, which is a long way of saying I focused on how we can use drought impact data in policy and planning. So the questions that have come up working at the Drought Center have really driven some interesting research that I've had the opportunity to pursue. So the big questions of drought planning are, how will you know when you're in a drought? This is the monitoring and early warning, pillar 1 component of the 3 pillars. And secondly, what do you need to protect from drought? This is the impacts and vulnerability assessment pillar. And that's what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. And this leads to the question, what are you going to do about it? And that breaks down into how will you reduce vulnerability ahead of time before the next drought? And how will you respond during drought? Impacts really are what drive vulnerability assessment. This chunk of text on the screen is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change chapter on how to assess vulnerabilities and risks from climate change. But what the point I really want to make here, 2 points. One is that there's this cluster of concepts, impacts, vulnerability, and risk, that are all closely related and can be interchangeable depending on how you're using them. Another key point is that we use, a lot of times we're talking about drought, it's very much in the context of climate change, and dealing with drought is often a more manageable start to dealing with climate change. Drought is one subset of climate change. It's one of the climate extremes that people will cope with as they're coping with climate change. So it can actually be easier to have a conversation about what are we going to do about drought than what are we going to do about climate change. But at the end of the conversation, you've also done something about climate change. So the general framework that I'm going to be using is that impacts are the result of sensitivity and exposure and adaptive capacity. In a mathematical term, mathematical context, impacts are our dependent variable. We're trying to figure out what's causing impacts. And we can't do very much about exposure, namely the weather, whether or not it rains. We can do more about sensitivity, what crops we grow where, how we manage our water supplies, and we can do more with adaptive capacity. What resources do people have to adjust and change? So we're thinking of impacts as a loss or change at a specific place and time due to drought. And impacts are a sign of underlying vulnerability. And it's that underlying vulnerability that you want to reduce before the next drought, to relieve suffering, relieve economic losses, prevent ecosystem damage. So sensitivity, that's what responds to a drought. Of course, some of the obvious things are rain-fed agriculture. Surface water is reduced, so that's less water for wildlife habitat. Hydropower production is reduced. Exposure is the drought itself, the drought occurrence, the intensity of drought, the extent of drought, the frequency, the seasonality. How often does it happen? What is your drought risk in a given location? And adaptive capacity is the ability to respond. I won't read you all the considerations there, but I will just say that it's fairly obvious that people with more resources have more adaptive capacity, greater ability to modify what they're doing or where they're doing it to avoid hazards. Financial resources are fairly obvious and visible. Often less obvious resources, though, may be social and cultural capital. Good social networks, certain cultural understandings may actually greatly increase the resilience of a location to drought, but that may not at all be obvious to people who are not familiar with that locality. So some of the resources are less visible. After you have gone through, identified impacts, and identified key vulnerability, identified the vulnerabilities that are underlying those impacts, there's a process of prioritizing the vulnerabilities, which are the most important to address. This list of, I believe it's 7 criteria, are from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is the criteria that they use for prioritizing vulnerabilities. That's magnitude. How big is the event or the exposure? Timing, how soon will something be a problem? Persistence or reversibility, I interpret that in context of drought as, for example, land degradation. That would be drought can tip things over into a persistent lower condition. The likelihood or the confidence of an event occurring. What is the adaptation potential? What is the distribution of risk geographically and socially? And what is the importance of the affected system? Sometimes one part of the bigger system can afford to take a hit to benefit something else that's more important. And this graphic is also from the IPCC. It shows on the left, the circle on the left is sort of a system under stress. And the undesired outcome is here at the lower right, where the system, that stress tips the system into a lower state of less human health and well-being, less equity and justice, lower economic health, overall reduced functionality of the Earth system. The preferred result is that that stress inspires us to transform the system into something that's more resilient, where the human system and the natural system are coexisting more peacefully and more harmoniously to increase the quality of life for those of us here on planet Earth right now. All of us, not just those of us who are already pretty comfortable. We also want to think holistically. As we're prioritizing vulnerabilities, this is kind of another three-legged stool. The big uses of water, and I like this map from the state of Hawaii because it shows all of these. The key uses of water are in-stream flows that support fish and wildlife, and also a lot of tourism and recreation, aesthetic values. But of course, agriculture, that's a very big sector that uses water, and urban water supply. Those tend to be the big three, and you can add in energy and industry as well. But really, agriculture, in-stream uses, and urban water supply are the most important ones that keep surfacing. They are kind of like a three-legged stool. There may be times where one of them can give a little to prioritize water for another sector, but in the end, they're all necessary. So the success stories that I've read tend to involve shared sacrifice, not uniformly prioritizing one sector over another. And at times when you need to adjust the balance, it's nuanced and subtle. It may not be permanent, but during this condition, we'll divert water for one purpose, but then it will revert back. And so it puts things in a detailed understanding of context, not a permanent one prioritized over the other arrangement. As you're considering what type of vulnerability process to undertake, of course, the sector consideration is really important. Historically and typically, we see agriculture and food security being one of the most sensitive sectors to drought. Water resources, of course, is also sensitive, highly sensitive to drought. Then ecosystems are vulnerable to drought. Human health is also affected by drought in various ways. And then other things kind of fall into place after that. Other considerations are kind of a lot of different scales that you could apply. Of course, what is the geopolitical unit that you're looking at, or the decision-making scale? It could be as small as a household or a single farm or ranch. Could be for a village where you maybe just have one water supply, or a city or a metropolitan area that's predominantly urban as opposed to rural, and where you have professionals managing the water supply. It could be for a state or a nation where you're thinking more about providing resources to the people who are actually allocating the flows of water and deciding whether water will be used for agriculture or urban areas. Hydrologically speaking, again, scale, are you talking about an individual well or a watershed or a river basin? It's just so that you're collecting data at the appropriate scale to match what the intent of your process is. And then technically, what resources are available? I would not say, it's really nice to have a lot of resources like GIS expertise, people who can do a lot of data processing and analysis, who can spend their working days doing that. But I think a lot can also be done based on local knowledge, even oral tradition, just a knowledge of where the water is and isn't, and the intent to be prepared for drought. I think that's probably the underlying factor that makes the difference with or without the technical resources. And then socially, there are social considerations as to who can and can't easily participate in a process. Some people are literally housebound and can't leave their house, or they are caregivers and need somebody else to care for young people or old people or dependent people so that they can leave the house and participate. Or there may be, some people are or are not comfortable speaking in public. Other people regularly advocate for their livelihood. And sometimes people have the luxury of doing it for a living. They're involved professionally. So all of these considerations will drive what type of process you end up using. So a key step then is to build a history of drought impacts, use the past as a guide to the future. One of the main questions we ask is, how has drought affected you in the past? Do you have a drought of record that everyone tells stories about, where everybody knows that a certain river went dry or a certain crop was not able to be harvested? What has happened in the past when you're in drought? And then kind of project that forward. What if that same drought happened again in the future, next year, in 6 months? What would the effects of that be? And another key question, of course, is there chronic stress on certain water supplies? If they're already chronically stressed, a drought can tip them over into crisis. There was a recent article in Nature in December that identified several likely impacts of drought in Brazil: crop failures, power costs, land degradation, food insecurity, disease, migration, interrupted industrial production. So I'm sure you're all also really familiar with that, but these are, I would say, not unique by any means, and certainly very important to address as well. One way to do to do research on historic drought impacts is in a library or whatever the contemporary equivalent is. Look for written records of drought impacts in newspaper or historic accounts or official government documents or NGOs. There may well be certain data that's recorded annually, like crop yield or water production. One interesting approach I've heard of is having youth interview elders in a community to sort of extract both what the drought impacts have been in the past and also what did people do about it. And that's kind of a nice community cultural capital building exercise if that ends up working for the circumstances. Of course, businesses may have records of shipments, receipts, or revenues. The chart I found on the right was simply from Googling Brazil drought impacts. It apparently the Fitch bond rating agency is registering a drought impact for Brazil. So that's another way of looking at drought impacts. So data can be qualitative, quantitative. It can be maps. It can be timelines. Think broadly, of course, because the impacts of drought are broad and go into many sectors. One of the things that has been produced over the years at the Drought Center is this checklist of impacts, or an impacts inventory that can be used to help identify vulnerable sectors. This is an example of an agricultural impacts inventory, and it's leading to, well, the questions relate to agriculture, but other vulnerable sectors that could be identified are industry or energy, for example. Using the approach of, is this a historically identified impact? Is it currently happening, or is it a potential impact that could happen in the future? And the value of these checklists is really just kind of to prompt ideas, and you can certainly systematically fill them out. As you know, you could take them with you to the library and make notes, and but all of this is kind of question prompts or data collection prompts. What has happened in the past, and is there a way to collect data about it systematically? We also have social checklists, and it's a little harder to find a non-copyrighted photo of people than it is of mosquitoes. In this case, a mosquito is representing vector-borne disease, which can increase during drought and have a definite effect on on human health. That is, of course, drought also affects food security. It can even lead to famine in extreme cases, typically where there's also a bit of a government breakdown. It can lead to limited water for washing or bathing, increased respiratory ailments, migration. This is quite a wide list of effects, of social effects of drought. And again, we're thinking of the who question. Social vulnerability is not evenly distributed across the economic spectrum. So who is feeling these effects? Who's paying more for water or power or food? Who has less to eat? Who has to relocate? Who has to sell assets? So those are all questions that really get at identifying vulnerable populations. And then there's also questionnaires that focus on environmental sensitivity. less habitat for aquatic life is an obvious environmental sensitivity. Also less drinking water for terrestrial wildlife, loss of wetlands, and of course, that all kind of rolls into ecosystem services, the overall health of the planet, the ability to sustain life. So identifying which areas are vulnerable to drought can help get at some of these crucial but somewhat underreported sectors. Then on the sensitivity side, I'm sorry, on the exposure side, I'm not going to talk a lot about how to physically measure drought because Deb Bathke is going to go into that in much more expertise than I'm able to. But I would just say that at this stage, as part of the vulnerability assessment, you'd be working with your drought early warning system team, the monitoring folks, to figure out how you're going to know when you're in drought and how bad has it been in the past. And where has it been in the past? So, and how have we measured it in the past? You're looking at different measurements of drought itself. You're looking specifically at weather data, rain, snow, temperature. You're looking at hydrology. You're looking at geology, like how are we using the land? How is the land shaped? All of these things contribute to your vulnerability to drought and the historic record of drought. And that is what that's what you're doing at this point. And again, I will leave most of that part of the talk to Deb. Adaptive capacity, along with sensitivity, is the part of the drought vulnerability equation that you've got more control over. Some of the key questions for addressing adaptive capacity are what policies and strategies are already in place that are helpful. Are certain sectors or groups better able to respond to or withstand the effects of drought? And of course, what could we be doing better? The community capitals approach is another widely used filter or lens for doing this kind of broad scale assessment of capacity, of adaptive capacity and resilience. I would also point out that the Sustainable Development Goals are an entirely relevant set of filters to consider as you're looking at what aspects can be strengthened, especially, how can you improve human and ecosystem well-being? Obviously, clean water and sanitation is directly related to drought. So is life on land, life below water, climate action, hunger. I'm not going to go through all of these, but if you really think about them, none of them are immune to drought. Oh, and no, poverty is, of course, a key vulnerability to drought also. One of the things that I also like about the Sustainable Development Goals is that they all include metrics, such as the proportion of the population using safely managed drinking water services or sanitation services. And I would say it's very relevant as you're looking at this to just be incorporating drought considerations into Sustainable Development Goals. How would give it the drought test? How would this metric change if our drought of record occurred again? How would that affect the proportion of population that's using safely managed drinking water services? Time-wise, I'm going to start moving pretty quickly. We did our group did some work in the Middle East, North Africa region, and I have a few slides related to Lebanon, where we went into a little bit of depth. This is an example of it's kind of a quick overview of their exposure, of the exposure component of vulnerability. It's got some timelines with some different indicators of drought, and they've added in refugee arrivals in the country. They've also taken into account land use. So there's a lot kind of splashed onto this slide, but they did do a nice drought history for part of this. Then they came up with a long list of drought impacts, including the climate impacts, and how that affected hydrologic systems, agricultural impacts, environmental impacts, and socioeconomic impacts. There's another three-legged stool for us. Then they grouped them as they prioritized them. I thought this was interesting. There's a national scale and also by regional basins. And some of the most important impacts from the previous slide made it onto this, the priority drought impacts. And from that, they extracted vulnerability. Certain crops are sensitive to temperature fluxes. And of course, to water supply. Soil degradation occurs, irrigation becomes less efficient, less available. Agriculture finance sector is stressed, and produce quality declines. On the government side, they also identified vulnerabilities, including they don't know how they're going to identify drought. There's not an official way to do that. That's kind of a major gap. And then no planning or coordination mechanisms. So basically, agencies and individuals are then left to respond on their own without government support. So these are some pretty valuable findings, very significant gaps that they identified that are opportunities to increase resilience. The next several slides are just reminders that we are living in what Edward Tufte, Tufte is a guru of data visualization. He's noted that we live in a multivariate world, and I would add that it's also an interdisciplinary, a multidisciplinary world. So the next several slides will kind of spark some ideas, I hope, or a sense of some of the filters that you might want to use as you're thinking about vulnerability assessments. So again, depending on your resources and scale, some of this may make a lot more sense for one process than for another. One approach is this kind of impact tree diagrams, where really you're just asking questions. Why did the crop fail? Well, we didn't have enough water. Why did that happen? There was a drought and we didn't have irrigation, or maybe we chose the wrong crop. It's it's a challenge, but it's an interesting exercise. It may prove fruitful in some circumstances. And then there's this very kind of system modeling approach from the hydrologic world. These charts may resonate for some of you. And there have been various efforts to put together different ways to quantify vulnerability. And again, there's no right or wrong way. It's about what fits for the circumstances. This is certainly one very credible effort. And here's a way to categorize possible response actions. Part of the function of the Pillar 2 effort is to make recommendations to Pillar 1. What are we going to do about this? Or I'm sorry, to Pillar 3, the management options. So we have here, they've categorized their different recommendations as either mitigation or response. This is a fairly recent example from the state of Colorado, which has a lot of resources. And they've got this kind of in-depth multi-sector flow chart for absorbing information and processing it and coming up with recommendations on or ratings of vulnerabilities of different sectors in different locations. So bottom line is Pillar 2 informs Pillar 3. That's what we're going to do about it. What do we do ahead of time? And what will we do during the next drought? And here are a few resources, some that I have mentioned explicitly and some I haven't, but they're there to be consulted. And with that, I thank you for your attention and would gladly entertain any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smith, for that excellent presentation with really tangible examples and for me personally, very thought-provoking to think about all the different elements and aspects and stakeholders that should be taken into account when making a holistic assessment of vulnerabilities. So while we're waiting for any questions, and please feel free to raise your hand, unmute your mic, or put them in the chat, I have a question for our audience in the interim, which is, what does it look like today in Rio Grande do Sul in terms of the interdisciplinary connectiveness for drought mitigation and for assessing vulnerability? What stakeholders are in the conversation, and maybe after this presentation, what stakeholders might you consider asking to join the conversation? And I can address that directly to colleagues in SEMA, or anybody who is listening in here could feel free to unmute and respond.
Bom, boa tarde. Vou
Good
tentar
afternoon.
responder
I'm gonna try to answer
a parte que eu entendi da pergunta. Mas,
what I got from the question.
tradicionalmente, a
Traditionally
questão
speaking,
de enfrentamento da estiagem,
to
ela tá
face
mais,
droughts,
sempre teve vinculado a obras
it's
de
always been
engenharia,
linked
tá?
to
Seja
engineering
perfuração de
works,
poços,
whether
construção de
it's drilling
reservatórios.
wells or reservoirs.
Embora existam
Even
informações de defesa civil ou da
there's
vigilância
information from
sanitária relacionadas
sanitary
ao
works
impacto da
or
estiagem
on the impact of the drought
nas comunidades, no meio
in
socioeconômico,
communities, in the
informações da
socioeconomic
agricultura
level,
também.
information on agriculture as well.
Para nós, na Secretaria de Meio
For
Ambiente, está sendo
us
bastante
at the Environment
interessante essa
Secretariat,
abordagem
it's interesting
do
to see
meio
this
socioeconômico.
approach of the socioeconomic area.
E já existem os planos de recursos
There
hídricos, e os
are
planos
water resource
e o plano
plans
estadual de recursos
and the
hídricos
state plan
que
of water
considera essa
resources
componente
that
do meio
considers this
socioeconômico,
component
mas
of socioeconomic
vinculado à
level
estiagem
linked to droughts.
é relativamente novo
This is
no nosso
relatively
processo de
new
gestão.
in our management process.
Thank you so much, Diego, for chiming in and to share that. And I wonder, Dr. Smith, if you have any reactions, as it is a new consideration, or any specific recommendations on where to start.
With the socioeconomic component, or?
Yeah.
I wish that I knew more about the circumstances in Brazil. As an outsider, I am hesitant to say too much. One thing I will say from my observation of the world's recent experience with the coronavirus is that it really underscored that we are all in this together. You know, a virus that arose in one faraway place has affected all of us, and things are extremely interconnected. So, you know, I think that this is kind of lapsing into a moral perspective, but I think that taking care of the most vulnerable people is really how we can ensure that we're all benefiting. And yeah.
Thank you for that. Thank you. I know it's a more broadly a wide question, and I think taking a moral perspective is obviously one that we hope our policies that we develop in any nation do take into consideration moral questions. And I think for the specific context here in Rio Grande do Sul, I know there is a lot of cooperation between the different state secretariats, and even in our work in the consulate, we work with the secretariat that helps to promote human rights and education secretariat as well. And I do really appreciate the interaction and collaboration I know that they have across state government here. So I wonder how this conversation around drought management, which does have direct impact on the lives of many people and the economy, as we saw in the second quarter of this year, have. So thank you for that. I'll give the opportunity, maybe one more minute if anyone has any specific questions for Dr. Smith.
And I would add that uh, a lot of times urban areas have the opportunity to be better buffered from drought in that there's a collection of people in one place who benefit from having professionals manage their water supply. I know that's why I live in a city. I don't want to have to deal with a well or the vagaries of what nature will provide. But that, that's a serious responsibility. There's been work in out of Cape Town recently, suggesting that the vulnerability to, they almost got down, they were counting the number of days left before they, taps would go dry a few years ago, and they were counting down to day zero, but that risk was not evenly distributed and it was somewhat socially constructed. So there are some really interesting resources available on the social construction of risk and preferential decision making.
Thank you so much for that. I haven't received any questions at this point, so I propose the following, that we thank again Dr. Smith for her time in this presentation. So thank you very much, Dr. Smith. We'll take a 5-minute break, and if Dr. Bathke agrees, we'll start the next presentation a little bit earlier, which means, is that an agreement, Dr. Bathke?
Yeah,
I think
that's
everybody
fine
is
with me.
appreciating excellent time management this Friday afternoon. So I propose that we start up again at, well, 3:40 for the following presentation. So I will see you all again in just a few minutes for the next presentation. I'm speaking on mute, aren't I? There we go. Good afternoon, everybody. Again, I'm very happy that we're all still here together this afternoon, and we have 2 more presentations in our first session of this risk management cooperation program today. I'd like to welcome Dr. Deborah Bathke, who will speak to us on integrated drought risk management and early warning and monitoring. Dr. Bathke, the floor is yours.
And I did the same thing you did. I was on mute. Let me share my screen here. I apologize, I did the wrong one. Everyone see that okay? If someone could give me a thumbs up or an okay that you're seeing the right slides.
That looks great, Dr. Bathke. I see it.
Great, thank you. So my name is Dr. Deborah Bathke, and I am a climatologist with the National Drought Mitigation Center. And I also coordinate our outreach, education, and engagement activities for the center. And in doing that, I work across all 3 of the pillars that we have been talking about today. The specific pillar that I will be talking about is the first pillar, which is monitoring and early warning. This is an outline of what I'll be talking about in the next 30 minutes. So first, I'll give you an introduction to drought monitoring and early warning systems. Then I will show some example approaches for monitoring drought. I will talk about how to make drought monitoring operational and linking drought conditions to management actions. And then finally, I'll sum up with some lessons learned and some final thoughts. So the monitoring and early warning pillar is linked to other pillars. You've heard this message multiple times today. What this means is that ideally, the information from your monitoring and early warning system will be linked to preparedness and response actions that are aimed at reducing drought impacts and losses for people and systems who are at risk during drought. In his talk, Mark related the 3 pillars working together as a 3-legged stool. This figure demonstrates that. So a successful drought policy is designed to stand on these 3 pillars. So monitoring and early warning, mitigation, preparedness, response that Mark talked about, and then the vulnerability and impact assessment that Kelly talked about. If one of these pillars in your drought policy is missing or it's weak, the drought policy won't work the way that it should. So the first pillar focuses on establishing a drought early warning information system. I like to put the word information in there for a country or a region or even a community. Well, what is the difference between a drought monitoring system and an early warning system? A drought monitoring system will track, assess, and report climate and water supply trends and current conditions. A comprehensive approach to drought monitoring involves monitoring across multiple parts of the water cycle. And Kelly showed some of these examples in her talk. So stream flow, groundwater level, reservoir levels, lake levels, soil moisture, but it also involves monitoring the impacts that occur on the ground as the drought develops. That helps us to calibrate assessment of drought severity for local areas. Kelly spoke in detail about these impacts earlier. Here I'm showing just a few examples. So it could be agriculture, wildfire, water supply, tourism, the ecosystem, or even those socioeconomic impacts. So what is a drought early warning system? A drought early warning system's main purpose is to warn local communities when there is a risk of a drought. It focuses on using networks to communicate timely and usable climate and drought information. It allows individuals to take action to avoid or reduce risk and to prepare for an effective drought response. So the idea behind early warning is that it's timely enough to allow policymakers and decision makers to, or individuals to put actions and to activate their plans and to put things in place. So I like to think of the difference between the two is that the monitoring system focuses on the data. So how do you know a drought is happening? While the early warning system focuses on how do you let others know that a drought is happening so that they can take action and prepare. So here I have some components of a drought monitoring and early warning information system. So this system consists of monitoring and forecasting. So what's happening right now and what do you expect to happen in the future? It also includes access to timely data, so including those impacts that Kelly talked about, and value added information. And what we mean by value added information could be synthesizing or analyzing the data to make it useful to decision makers, to tying it to actions in your drought plan, or even creating tools for decision makers. So to determine what timely is and what's usable, you would need to have or think about a user needs assessment. So talking about everyone who could be impacted by drought, those different sectors or groups of people, and finding out what decisions they need to make and identifying data that will help you provide the tools that they need. Important piece of a drought monitoring and early warning information system is the efficient communication of your drought information. So whether that's through the internet, a website, the media, radio, newspapers, however you need to get the word out to reach people who are affected by drought. It also involves linking that monitoring data to drought risk assessment and planning, and then education and awareness. Next, I will talk about example approaches for monitoring drought. So drought monitoring can use several different approaches. Three that I'm going to mention here are shown below. So the first is to use a single index or indicator. So an index would be a variable like precipitation, and an indicator would be putting it into a mathematical equation such as the standardized precipitation index. So Here I'm showing the standardized precipitation index. That index is recommended by the World Meteorological Organization for monitoring meteorological drought. You can also use multiple indices or indicators. These are standalone objective products, like I'm showing here on this slide, that blends different types of data into a single tool. The one I'm showing here is a short-term objective drought blend that the National Drought Mitigation Center developed. We also have the same product for long-term drought as well. And then finally, we have what's called a hybrid approach, and that is like the US Drought Monitor. And Mark Swoboda, who spoke earlier, our director, was involved in developing this product. So I just wanted to recognize that for those of you who may not know that. What makes the US Drought Monitor unique compared to these other types of monitoring processes is that it combines objective data. So it combines that physical data, such as stream flow and precipitation and evapotranspiration and things like that, with subjective expertise. So local experts provide feedback on the map, and then whoever is drawing the lines on the map adjusts the lines according to that feedback. Drought monitoring products that blend multiple drought indicators and indices into a single product or map are often referred to as combined drought indices, or sometimes I've seen it called a composite drought index as well. The National Drought Mitigation Center has developed these combined drought indices, or CDIs, for the United States, like I showed on the previous slide, but we've also worked with countries around the globe to do the same type of thing. A few of these are shown here, including in Brazil, Australia, multiple countries in the Middle East and North Africa region, and also in Southern Africa. Example of the combined drought index process that we followed in our work with partners in Jordan. The same process was followed with partners in many of the countries that I showed on the previous slide. So just a quick overview of how that process works is that first you need to collect the climate data or download the climate data from satellites, surface observations, or computer models. Select the drought indicators. So this is based on what data is available. Is it in a format that you can use? Is it of a good quality? Is it timely? Can you get it when you need it? And it's also based on those decision-making needs. The third step is to put the data into historical context. So how do the conditions now compared to drought conditions in the past? Kelly talked about that, the drought of record and things like that. So that's what this step does. The approach that we've used in many of these composite drought indicator products is to use the percentile method. And I'll talk more about that in a couple of slides. But what that method does is it ranks data and it helps you assign drought severity levels that can then be used to trigger actions in your response plans. Once you have your data and you have it into a historical context or a common reference frame like that, then you would assign relative weights to the different indicators involved in that. And that can be a process that is based on expert judgment by the scientists, by the in-country partners, or even through techniques such as machine learning. And then finally, all of those individual indicators or data types are blended together and used to create a map. So you have, instead of having 4 or 6 different indices, you would have a single map that has relevant information for drought management. In drought monitoring, we use an approach that's called the convergence of evidence. What the convergence of evidence process is that all inputs serve as independent indicators, and they tell their own story. So here I've circled a part on each map, the same region on each map, and you can see that each of the different indicators shows a different level of drought. So with the precipitation map, it shows that it's very severe. Evapotranspiration, not quite as severe. Vegetation health and soil moisture are creating a little bit different picture of drought. But when we combine them all together, we can have confidence that if an area shows up in drought on our composite drought indicator, that it's because it shows up in all of the other indicators as well too. So now I'm going to go back to the hybrid approach as opposed to using multiple indicators. And this approach, the example is the US Drought Monitor that's used in the United States. It classifies drought severity using a number of indicators and indices blended together with a subjective interpretation based upon the expertise of the local author. So someone like myself, I'm an author for the US Drought Monitor, and also a network of what we call local experts that exist around the country who provide us input every week on what drought looks like in their state. In the US Drought Monitor and in the combined drought indicator maps, drought categories are assigned using percentiles. So in the percentile process, data are ranked from largest to smallest. So you have your time series of, for an example, precipitation or rainfall data for 100 years, and you would rank it from the amount that had the most amount of rainfall to the amount that has the least amount of rainfall. And with percentile, how it's used in the drought monitor to assign the categories is the 2 amounts that are the smallest, so the 2 lowest rainfall amounts in that 100-year period are assigned the category of exceptional drought. The 2 amounts that take up locations 3 through 5 are assigned the category extreme drought, and so on and so forth. Notice here that I've labeled categories for the dry side, but it can also be that same breakdown for the wet side. So the percentile is a good approach to give you both the dry and wet side for the climate. So percentiles tell us the historical likelihood that conditions will occur. So this is the classification that's used by the US Drought Monitor. Other combined drought indicator maps use different breakdowns. Some may use deciles, so a breakdown of every 10 instead of what we do. But on the classification used by the US Drought Monitor, if it's classified as exceptional drought, so remember that was that lowest 2 indicator values in a 100-year period of record, that would be the type of event that you would expect to occur once every 50 to 100 years. Drought, so that 3rd through the 5th percentile, that frequency would be the type of drought that you would expect once per 20 to 50 years. Percentiles have several advantages. They can be applied to any parameter. So I've shown for the example precipitation, but they can also be applied to stream flow, to soil moisture conditions, or any numerical time series of data that you have. Well, I've used an example of 100 years just because it's easier to calculate percentages in my head. You can use percentiles for any length of record. We recommend at least 30 years of data. And then again, that advantage that I've said several times is percentiles help put drought into historical perspective. Percentiles are the backbone or the basis of the combined drought indicator approach and also the hybrid approach that's used in the US Drought Monitor. We saw what the convergence of evidence looked like for the combined drought indicator approach. This is what it looks like for the US Drought Monitor. So with the US Drought Monitor, we have several different types of data. We have that physical data from the different points of the hydrological cycle. So rainfall, evaporation, reservoir levels, vegetation health. We have drought impacts that are collected through various mechanisms at the state level or through a tool that we house at the National Drought Mitigation Center called CMOR, which Kelly can correct me if I get the acronym wrong, the Condition Monitoring, Observation and Reporting System, I believe. And then we have that third piece, the feedback and the interpretation from local experts. So convergence of evidence, ideally, if we assign a drought category as an author, we will look to see where all 3 of those different pieces of evidence are telling the same story. So now that we've talked about these different approaches for monitoring drought, how do you put that system in place for either a country or a state or a region? I'll show some examples of that next. So this is the operational production and of a combined drought index, but it can really the process applies to any drought monitoring product. The example here is for the country Jordan, but this process is very similar to what we use for the US Drought Monitor. So I've broken it down into 5 steps. So again, that first step is download the data, calculate those individual inputs, blend and map the data, and then distribute that map to a network of experts for feedback on impacts and conditions. And this can be in either based on a historical drought event when you're initially developing the product, or it can be operationally in near real time like we do with the US Drought Monitor. This validation process allows for ownership of your map or your product at the local level. It's not something that's just coming top down from the government. Once you distribute the map or that product for feedback, then you incorporate it and you need decide how you're going to incorporate it, and then you release your final map, or which could be a drought declaration map or a product. And then that last step, and it's just as important as every other step in there, is to communicate that final map or product to policymakers, the media, and the general public. So here I've just circled that validation component of it, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that next. So this slide shows considerations for establishing a validation system. So when you're doing that, you want to think about who will provide feedback, who will be in that network of evaluators. Will it be government officials? Will it be university researchers? Will it be agricultural producers? Do you want to include the private sector? It can be any of those, or groups that aren't listed on here, or a combination of them. In the United States, for the US Drought Monitor, we include government officials and staff and university researchers. We don't include producers of the private sectors, because that map is tied to drought relief. We don't want anyone who would stand to benefit from a certain drought category to be part of that evaluation process. The next step in that is to think about what type of information will they provide. So do you have individuals who can give you feedback on vegetation health, whether it's part of agriculture or part of the ecosystem? Do you want to include meteorologists and climatologists who can speak to recent weather conditions and trends, maybe for those spaces that are in between where a rain gauge might be? Or do you want to include folks who are knowledgeable about soil moisture and soil health? To think about how will they provide the information. Will it be through email? Will it be through a regularly or semi-regularly scheduled video conference? Will you have a web survey or even a paper survey that you email out to folks that they send back in? And then part of that is, how often do you want them to do that? What's realistic? Will you expect folks to do that every week, every month, or some other time frame? Then finally, what will you do with that information? Monitoring side, but in the education and outreach side of my job, we tend to say, don't ask for information that you don't intend to use. Based on our experience in the United States and working with other countries, we've come up with some critical elements of a drought monitoring system. So no matter which approach you use, whether it's if you're basing your drought monitoring system off a single indicator or a combined drought indicator, or a more complex process like the US Drought Monitor. So these elements include partnerships. Think about who should be involved and who has what capabilities for the process. For example, the US Drought Monitor authors come from federal agencies, so our United States Department of Agriculture, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, and then from the university setting of the National Drought Mitigation Center. The National Drought Mitigation Center also is the website home of the US Drought Monitor. And part of the reason for that is it's easier, at least in the United States, for a university to quickly get information up on a website than it might be for a federal government agency. The second element is to have a realistic process. Think about what you can realistically do with the resources that you have. So that includes with the number of staff that you have available to you, with the data that you have available to you, with the technological expertise that you have available to you. The U.S. Drought Monitor is a pretty complex process, but it started simple and was built up over time. We realized that this process to create that map isn't doable for everyone or for every country. Another important consideration is to be flexible and to be adaptable. Be open to change if new data sources become available. Mark can speak to this, but I think the U.S. Drought Monitor, when it started, had maybe 5 indicators that were part of the process when it started in 1999. And now authors look at dozens of indicators. It seems like every time there is a severe drought in the US and we learn something new about how drought behaves, someone comes up with a new way to look at the data, a new combination of the data to help us do a better job of detecting and characterizing that drought. As I've said before, a communication network is critical. If people don't, it's one thing to be able to monitor the drought, to detect a drought, but if no one knows there's a drought, you aren't able to take actions to reduce those impacts. And then finally, near and dear to me is education and awareness. Letting people know about the drought monitoring product and your drought plan and how it was created and developed helps create buy-in to your whole drought monitoring and early warning system. Next part is, and Mark talked a little bit about this, is linking drought conditions to management actions. So this is how you link the drought monitoring to those other 2 pillars. So, and we do that through what we call drought triggers. Drought triggers are specific values of indicators. So drought indicators like rainfall or soil moisture, and indices like the standardized precipitation index or even a combined drought index that are linked to the timing of specific drought response actions. So an indicator is a single value or parameter used to describe drought condition. That is basically your raw data. That data becomes more valuable when you turn it into information such as an index or a mathematical computation that helps you determine drought severity levels. Then finally, triggers are those predetermined values or thresholds that are used to initiate or terminate drought management strategies, actions, or policies. And as Mark pointed out, lots of places may have triggers for going into drought, but it's just as important to know when you're in it. It's oftentimes harder to know when you're coming out of drought and when you should terminate or end those strategies. So while indicators and indices address questions such as how do we know we're in a drought or how severe is a drought, triggers address the question, when do we take action and who takes action? General overview process that we call from science to action. So it starts with developing your initial drought monitoring product and then turning it into policy. So this is the step we've used in the past with partners. It starts out with the research team, such as the National Drought Mitigation Center, that might be working with country partners or country level researchers to research and develop the combined drought index. Next, the research team, once they have that drought index, they deliver it to or send it to country partner. So whoever within the country is going to be the home for that product. Third step is to evaluate it to see if it makes decision-making needs. Again, this could be using historical data or real-time data. And then that fourth step is to produce it operationally, see if it's a realistic process for what your capabilities and your resources are. The fifth step is you start to turn that into policy. So you need to link those drought severity levels to specific management actions. And Mark gave some examples of those. The triggers, you need to make it official by documenting it and putting it in a drought plan that's then publicized to increase awareness and create consensus and buy-in. Note the arrows on the bottom of the slide. That is a transition of responsibilities where it starts out with the project team or the researchers having the primary responsibilities and then transitions to where the country partner takes over the process. And then next, I have just a couple slides on some final thoughts. So drought early warning and information systems and your drought risk management are related to one another. This is a message all three of us, Mark, Kelly, and I, have said throughout our talks, is that they're related, they're linked together, but they actually form a cycle. So, once you get a monitoring and early warning system, like on the ground, you get it up and running, over time, ideally, it will get better, it will improve. So as that drought early warning system and monitoring gets better, you need better drought risk management strategies, so planning and mitigation. So the need for those better strategies increases. So once you implement those planning and mitigation strategies, then you need drought monitoring and early warning. So it's a cycle. They're linked together. So ideally, your whole system, your system as a whole will improve the more you learn. Need for value added information and triggers drives this cycle. Okay, some final thoughts. This is just repeating some things I've said throughout my talk today. So drought monitoring and an early warning information system includes monitoring those current conditions. And I didn't speak a lot about it, but forecasting what may happen in the future. Once you have a monitoring system in place, due diligence is needed. One needs to be, even if it's an automated process or not, someone needs to be paying attention to it. Drought should never sneak up on anybody. If you have a system in place and you're regularly meeting and regularly watching. Monitoring is the foundation of drought risk management and planning. It is tied to the other two pillars. So ideally, information from your monitoring and early warning system will be linked to those preparedness and response actions are aimed at reducing drought impacts and losses for people and systems at risk. Drought monitoring. Number 4, drought monitoring and early warning information systems can serve as a trigger for response actions. So a trigger for who does what and when, if it's properly tied to a drought plan. Just a couple of last comments. Globally, we're seeing a shift toward the development of more remote events. So data from satellites or radar, modeled or gridded products, combined drought indices that are being used and integrated into drought early warning systems. So that's kind of the shift that we've seen from station-based data that can be hard to get to. There may be access issues, processing issues, widely spaced data to that gridded coverage of an area. And finally, standalone decision support tools and applications and services help bridge the gap between drought monitoring, early warning, preparedness. So some of the things that Mark and Kelly have both talked. And here is my contact information. If anyone has questions that they want to email later, and I will take questions, I guess, in the chat box if someone has those.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bathke. That was really excellent, really pragmatic presentation. I learned a lot, and it's very interesting also for me to learn how we do it in the United States. And I hope it's interesting to our colleagues here in Brazil. We'll give a moment for any questions to come in. And while we're waiting, I'm wondering, Dr. Bathke, specifically for indicators, historical indicators that are used in indices, what is the impact of climate change that you're seeing on the reliability of these indicators?
I'll invite Mark to jump in on this as well. Mark, do you want to take the first stab at this based on that virtual meeting we just participated in a week ago?
Yeah, you're just trying to see if I was still paying attention. So yeah,
I was.
I'm still here.
He likes to do that.
No Caparina quite yet. So it's a great question. The discussion Deb is referring to, there's some conversations going around some of the drought scientists in the United States recently to address this question. And I think if I could paraphrase where I think we're on common ground is that we talk about percentiles and the more data you have, the better. But what we're learning is that our reference period needs to be shorter because of the increase in temperature, say the last 20, 30 years. So we need to use that as our climate reference period to account for these shifts in temperature and what it does to the various drought indicators, particularly those that measure potential evapotranspiration, for example, ET or PET, atmospheric thirst, whatever you want to call that. Temperature plays a big role. And as I mentioned earlier too, and Deb captured nicely in her talk, you know, that temperature affecting the hydrologic cycle is changing the way droughts behave and the way they evolve. And I talked about flash drought, rapid onset, rapid intensification drought. So I think I don't think it's if you've heard of this, to put it in streamflow perspective, you've heard this terminology maybe in Brazil, and Eduardo can speak to it as well. Stationarity is dead. So if you're designing things as an engineer, you have these 100-year rule curves, a 250-year rule curve for floods. With climate change, the past isn't a perfect prologue to the future now because of increasing temperatures. Our extreme events and the way they behave is changing on the tails of the distribution. So these are the things we're trying to still grasp and understand better, and we're still learning. Thanks, Deb.
Thanks, Mark. Are there any other
Okay.
questions?
I'll give one last moment, and for our Brazilian colleagues, these can be questions or reactions as well. We have about 4 minutes for those. I know that, well, I'm also interested now in learning about the data and tools that are used here to yeah, to look at indices to try to forecast and monitor drought. I see Diego.
Bom, mais uma vez, boa tarde. É apenas uma interação.
Good afternoon once again. It's
É uma
just a
interação apenas.
comment, just an interaction that I'd like to make. About a year and a half, the Rio Grande do Sul started being a part of this management of drought, and we saw one of these maps that she showed, the Brazilian map. We saw Rio Grande do Sul, our state there. It's being a great experience, very rich one. The technicians are there, and we're always emphasizing that the drought monitoring reflects, it is some sort of rare mirror, you know, it shows what's past already. We understand this as being important, but something, you know, that really concerns us is what's happening in the next years and next periods, you know, the next drought. It's just something that I'd like to
Thank you,
say.
Diego, and I do hope that some of the information from Dr. Bathke's presentation can inspire thinking about this forecasting. And all 3 presentations today really do emphasize the planning and coordination and different areas to be considering when creating a plan to think about drought. So I hope that this information is helpful. With that, I think we'll go straight into our next presentation. So thank you everybody for hanging with us this Friday afternoon, this rainy Friday afternoon down here in Porto Alegre, and to our presenters and our other visitors from the United States for being on the line. It's great to have you as well. Our final presentation we're all looking forward to is from Eduardo Martins, who is representing the Fundação Cearense de Meteorologia e Recursos Hídricos, obviously in Ceará. So welcome to you, Eduardo, and thank you so much for being here. And we look forward to this specific case study that has resonance in Brazil. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. I will switch idioms, okay? I will talk in Portuguese. I switch the channel, but first I would like to thank you, Mark, for inviting me to be here and share a little bit what the work that we are doing in terms not only of drought monitoring, but also in drought planning as well. Ok, I will share my... Eu vou compartilhar meus slides.
Let me share my presentation with you guys.
Vocês estão vendo minha tela?
Can you guys see my screen?
Estamos vendo, sim.
Ok.
All right.
Ok.
Muito bem.
Eu vou falar pouco sobre a nossa
I'm going to speak a little bit about our experience, the Brazilian experience.
dos atores, né, a rede
We are one of the players, one of the actors, right? Kind of the family for drought monitoring and management is growing. The family is growing. Like Diego said, they've been doing this for a year and a half in Rio Grande do Sul, Santa Catarina, and Paraná, which is the southern part of Brazil. We went to the Midwest of Brazil, and we are up now in the Northeast region because we really want to do this. We want to cover all these areas. We've done 2 states already in the North region, and we're working now in the state of Amazonas. Well, what motivated us to do this? It was a very long-term drought that we had in the northern region here in Brazil, in Ceará, starting in 2012. Some regions, some geographical regions still feel the bad, severe impacts. The reservoirs are still not fully completed. I mean, so this was really prolonged. It was really, really severe. This is the biggest reservoir of our state, 6.7 B cubic meters. And where you can see, do you see that bench, you know, the bench of that square there, which was years and years ago, and a few years ago, I mean, that was completely flooded years and years ago. And then when the big drought came, you could see that bench again. Of course, our Brazilian colleagues are very aware of our situation, but the context of the Northeast region is like this. We have some regions that are very susceptible to problems like that, because it's very hard to recover the micro phase. It's difficult because we have a dry season and a rainy season. It's hard to deal with the impacts of severe droughts. In my vision, I think some of our speakers already mentioned, this is a very personal perception, I must say, but I think the most important difficulties in dealing with water crisis in Brazil is infrastructure. Too much emphasis on the infrastructure solution. I mean, sometimes we just forget planning, because drought, we think about the drought as being something super future, and no, it's also an institutional challenge. We have difficulties in Brazil. According to my perspective, Brazilians don't work very well in collaboration. We need more coordination among institutions, because it's not only one sector. It's not the agriculture sector is responsible for drought. No, it's connected with environment, with food industry, and so on. So we need more policies. We need to strengthen this works. It's across work. I mean, people should work in collaboration. And another serious problem, it is the local scale, water management local scale. Of course, the most vulnerable communities, the population that very, very low income, they're very vulnerable. So actually, the drought agenda is very important. When we go to the water sector, we see that the governance is just do macro system, reservoirs, water transfers, and so on. But locally, they do not have that agenda, and we need to do it. This governance should be, of course, macro, but also more micro too, taking in consideration municipalities, neighborhoods, and so on. I'm not gonna talk about this slide much, because Mark already spoken. In the northeast region, in the northeast is like what the rain washes away is the memories of the past drought, pretty much. It is a popular saying here in my area, but it's true. We have to think about, to remember that, and not forget about the last drought. You know what I mean? So planning and preparedness should be based on risk management. This image also was explained by Mark, so I'm not going to, dig into it. Well, as Mark already said, and our other colleagues too, the 3 pillars are important in our system that we've tried and we're still trying to implement in a more effective way here in Brazil, is based on the 3 pillars for drought management. It's based on the American model, not only as far as monitoring goes, but also in planning. Of course, we adapted all that to our conditions, because we are a different country and we have different climate conditions here, and infrastructure, and so on and so forth. Of course, we have our particular characteristics. So we have Brazilian drought monitor. We have that. Also, we work with the forecast system. It covered the Northeast, the Southeast region, the Middle East of Brazil, and now we are up there in the Amazon, also Rondônia. The Brazilian forecast system is also important because the seasonal. I don't like to talk about drought forecast. It's hard to say that, but we have to think about the seasonability of the droughts and also the severity of the drought. We don't preview. It's difficult to have a certain forecast of the drought, but of course we can follow some indicators that can give us an idea of what's going to happen in that region from some point of time on. And the issue of vulnerability, resiliency, and impact assessment, we did that. That's the second pillar. And we are now in the process of updating that. We did that 8 years ago, and we're updating the system now in order to, because we're discussing the drought policies among the states and so on, the Brazilian states. And in terms of mitigation and response planning measures, we focused on drought plans, very specific ones, and contingency sector specific plans. The mitigation is related to actions before the event happens, so previous to the event. So in that sense, these plans are actually created. My presentation is pretty much based on that, in that red one. So this is just for you to have an idea as far as numbers. We are basically covering 100% of Brazil. The northern region is very much affected. We started this in 2014. We calculate many indicators, pointers. Each state has a set of indicators. Whatever we have it available in our hands, we use it. Mark has already spoken about this process, and the other ladies too. So we follow the same template, right? So we do that. We shift with other states, and there is a validation process with institutions that have capillarity in the territory, and they can point, they can show evidences, they can really make observations. And these observations must be consistent. We use support products as well, and these products, they complement the network. In some states, some regions are less dense, so we use all available information. We also are making efforts in introducing models to produce indicators to incorporate these indicators in drought monitoring. We are doing this in Ceará, but we are in contact with people from Belo Horizonte, in the state of Minas Gerais. Sorry, in the UPH in Porto Alegre, not BH, but Porto Alegre in Rio Grande do Sul, because we're producing these indicators. We want to actually spread them throughout all the Brazilian territory. I put my state, Ceará. We started with this climate network, and we started adding other sectors and other industries. So agriculture, water management, research institutions, stakeholders, users, the climate research, the environment sectors too, in order to get feedback from those stakeholders. And that was the important thing. This is Rio Grande do Sul, the map of the state, showing the differences of these two states. I mean, it's a work done by the state, Rio Grande do Sul, and us from Ceará try to collaborate. And this is a image of the drought in Rio Grande do Sul. The family has grown. Now we are this cluster of institutions. We would like to be even more, because the knowledge shared is amazing, you know, and the lessons learned are huge. I think the most important thing is that, you know, of course, the technical side of it is important, but it's simple. But actually the discussions, the debate, and actually increasing the awareness, because the event is coming up. And that's the main gain, I think, to see that people can definitely use the data and this data analysis in order to preview and to take action before a possible event that is about to come up. The other thing, which was a very important gain too, was the access to data. With that monitor, we had a big effort. We have data now coming from many Brazilian states in order to produce that map. So it was a very, very rich work in terms of the debate and collaboration from all the parts. And this has helped the production of all the indicators that we've been working with. And more data are added as we are adding new networks. So it's very interesting. About forecast, I'm not going to talk about much about the drought forecast. I'm just going to show you some case study. It's important to talk about some regional models, and then after we analyze these regional models, we use impact models for these information to produce information as far as stream flow prediction, drought characteristic, and so on, and even indicators of droughts that might make us identify the areas in which this drought is going to be intense or decrease. Even though we can't preview, you know, we can have a perfect forecast for drought, but this information is important. This information is made available in the portals in order so everybody can have the report. So then the user can just go ahead and click, so he can find some information, some climate information, whatever, has access to all that information. You know, and we try to work together with the user. We have to make the information matter, because we need to understand what is decision process, what's the format of that decision, and the information must be not only useful but usable in order to make impact, in order to be important and relevant. In the case of the monitor, this was really interesting, because the first use of the information was done national civil defense. They got it, they crossed the data of that monitor with the municipality's data. If the municipality has any percentile of that area with a moderate drought or exceptional drought, there's no need to inform anything else in order to be included into the program. So this is not the only element used to enter in that program. If that information doesn't put the municipality into the program, it has to be corrected. But if the monitor says already that the municipality has a percentile of moderate drought or maybe more severe, automatically the municipality is included into the program. The other information, the other way of doing that was per region in Paraná hydrographic region.
Do Paraná, e aí eu estou ouvindo o canal em inglês também. Não sei se mudou automaticamente. Bom, então o que
So what Ana has done. She put this as one of the tools to decide a hydrological crisis in the basin. Now she wrote a resolution for the National Board of Water Resources. One of the tools to have the drought monitor used for this. Well, working in the mitigation and response pillar, we did a diagnosis planning work to identify mitigation actions. First diagnosis was trying to understand the framework, the legislation, the policies, understanding also for each system, because the contingencies plans were done specifically. This is going to understand how the systems were being operated, the trying to evaluate the vulnerabilities of the system and planning, identifying the preparedness and mitigation strategies for an eventual drought. From simulations and other tools, we used these hydrological models for some of the systems to define the drought categories, to see what the triggers would be, and then the mitigation and response actions. In this case, mitigation keeps on involving the monitoring, the forecast, implementation of actions, the reviewing of the plan. One of the concepts that we established is the plan is a dynamic plan. We run it with the players that are already working with a specific system, and with that, we incorporate new measures or reviewing measures which were not really good in the response to a drought. As other droughts are experienced, we analyze what happened during that drought and we revisit the plan. So this document is dynamic. We have plan 0, and this is just the beginning of the story. We build first identifying how this particular system is run. We must have actions for any of the drought conditions. In normal times, we keep on doing the monitoring, reviewing, implementing long-term actions, could be communication. As we have a drought established, we have short-term actions, and then we start implementing more emergency actions as the restrictions of some uses for reservoirs. And this issue of the plans, we are working in many different ways. We have a state level plan, at the basin plan, a watershed, and one for specific things for water supply companies, plans for irrigation system, for hydro systems, plans for agriculture. I want to say that we don't have plans for all systems. We have cases specific that we chose as, and we keep on working in these cases. These plans, I want to highlight, they have different spatial scales, they have different objectives. We are concluding the first plan for the basin of one of the reservoirs, the Patu Reservoir Basin. And we have 12 plans ongoing in the state of Ceará. The idea is to have these tools, they're delivered to the basin committee, the management company, which are those players who are going to follow the company who implements the action, and the committee follows and sees whether they're working on it right or not. I am going to give you an example of the hydro system. Let's say you have a reservoir. We ran simulations based on the last experience, closest as possible to the present. Stationary is dead. We need something close to our present day, and we define the triggers, in this case for the reservoir, at what level we are not going to respond to a certain water use. This is not in Ceará. This was done for the national water system for Paraíba. And here, for each level, we have the uses that will be assisted. As the drought becomes more severe, the color is stronger, the uses are more restricted to what's more necessary, human supply. So the idea is to define this from all the tools that we already have available, the classic tools. With that, we have the triggers, and we already know what to do, who to assist. So the system operators will know this beforehand. Likewise, we've done for the World Bank in Pernambuco, Jucazinho system, to assist the city. The idea was to analyze all the aspects we were talking about, institutional, legal aspects, the tolerance, the levels of drought. We could have like 3 levels or more, depending on the rules, to operate the reservoir. The drought monitoring system works at a national level. With a smaller one like this, maybe this will not trigger the needs for the system, but the monitor will alert. We have that large red spot in the region. We know we're going to have a problem there. If you have a plan, you look at the specific monitoring of that system, and with that, you have your triggers. And they're developed based on simulations, trying to identify the response actions for each of the levels of the system. We have many different alternatives in drought categories. We establish the different scenarios, and we identify complementary sources of water when we have a bigger crisis. And then we define the decision-making criteria. I've talked about the triggers, the restrictions for each drought stage, and we can get to, with a moderate drought, below an alert level, a reduction of 10%, with a severe drought below a drought level. We may have a 20% reduction, with a severe one 30%, and so forth, so on. This is defined by hydrological simulation, operating with the reservoir. To conclude, this is just to give you an overview of what's being done. This effort of the contingencies plan is huge. Each sector, each system demands a specific study. It's not easy. The focus, when it's not agriculture, depending on moisture, kind of harvest you're going to be working with that year, the crop. When you're operating a reservoir or a water supply company, that plan is specific for that system. That's why it's so hard, the effort. We must have a study for each system. To start the process, our choice was first the right cases, the most critical ones that could help us prove the concept, the value of the initiative of preparedness for a drought response action. And the idea of showing with local players that they should be involved in this preparedness strategy. No one is going to put any new scheme or totally new to work a plan from a different system. We're going to be working with the people who are already there. We're going to train them, and we're going to build the responses together with these people who are there. I think this is what makes us stand out. We're not trying to do anything so out of the local reality. We are trying to build together with local players who know the area, what's happening, more than any expert from outside. This is what I'd like to say. I'd like to thank you. I hope the presentation was good to enlighten you on what we've been doing.
Dr. Martins, thank you so very much for your presentation. I hope that the whole community online enjoyed and appreciated it. I know I surely did, and I appreciate everyone who has stayed on the line to participate in our full program today. I know it's a long program, but I think a very, very robust program. And I'd like to give a special thanks to all of our presenters for taking the time, for traveling virtually all the way down here to Brazil. And as I am a layperson, I feel very comfortable giving you all the thanks for making it rain this afternoon down here. So thank you very much for that. A special thank you as well to our partners here in Rio Grande do Sul, representing the Secretary for Environment, for Agriculture, as well as the regulatory agency FIPON, Civil Defense that's on the line, and many others who took their time to be with us this afternoon. I've shared a short poll in the chat just to gather some feedback. You can leave it anonymous or you can share your information as you'd like. It will help us as we are still navigating this program. And before we go, I'd really like to offer a very big and special thank you to someone we haven't heard from on the line today, Elizabeth Goffey, who is from the Department of Interior's International Technical Assistance Program, who actually made this entire project possible, including the content and bringing all of our presenters together to really respond to the needs that our Brazilian counterparts and colleagues have identified. So thank you so much, Elizabeth, for all your help, technical, programmatic, and otherwise. And with that, I look forward to seeing everyone next Wednesday for the second session of our U.S. Rio Grande do Sul cooperation program. The second session on Wednesday will focus on understanding drought's impact on agriculture through data, and we'll have presenters from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, and the U.S. Department for Agriculture. We have a third session at the end of October, the 26th of October, which will bring together both the policy preparedness and monitoring to really focus on response. So that will be the third session of this program as well. The link for the second edition of this program is not the same. I can drop it in the chat here so you have it, and otherwise the information, I'll also share my contact information if anybody needs to reach out to ask any additional questions about the programming. To our colleagues in the United States, I'm sure many of our colleagues here in Brazil would be very happy to offer you caipirinhas and especially churrasco down here in Rio Grande do Sul. If you can make it, you're most welcome. And really, thank you very much. I hope that this is just the beginning of conversation and collaboration, because I think so much of what was shared today is valuable, both on the Brazilian and the U.S. side. So thank you very much. I'll stick around if anyone has any immediate questions. And with that, I hope to see many of you on Wednesday, same time, different link, still talking drought. Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate it. Ciao, ciao.